Hi, I'm Nicholas Meritis, and this presentation is about the 1972 Summit Series and the Cold War. The 1972 Summit Series is one of the hottest conflicts of the Cold War. The 1972 Summit Series were comprised of 8 games played between the Russian Red Army Tram and all-star players of Canadian professionals. This series of games was much about politics, diplomacy, national identity as much as it was about skating and scoring. 4 games were played in Canada and were held in Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. The other 4 games were played in Russia and were all held in the communist capital of Moscow, Sports Palace. The games were divided between the 2 national teams and were influenced by political ideologies and had different culture and different beliefs. The Cold War was all about international affairs and conflict between many countries around the globe. Even though during the Second World War, during the Germany invasion, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies. After World War II, the 2 sides have very different views on how to reconstruct the world. The USSR, the United Soviet Union Republic, built the world around communism and fear, while North America were all about industrialized revolution, freedom, and capitalism. These were 2 opposing views. The 1972 Summit Games between Russia and Canada reflected the opposing beliefs in these 2 very different worlds. Matthew Stroth described the Summit Series as an attempt between Canada and the USSR to bridge the gap using ice hockey, a sport that is loved by both nations. The Hockey Summit Series, after all, was an effort between Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and the Soviet communist statesman Alexei Kosygin. They had agreed to introduce hockey competitions between the 2 countries. When they agreed into the 1972 Hockey Summit Games, for Canadians, it meant that they would show the world their excellent hockey skills, talent, and love for the sport. The USSR people wanted to surprise Canada and the world by showing their higher skills and claim that the sport is their own. Hockey in Canada is ingrained into the culture. Hockey is the game that Canadians of every age is playing in the streets, ice rinks, and frozen ponds. The Canadian hockey team prepared without a doubt to win the Summit Games. Everyone believed that the win belonged to the Canadian team, even the Russians. The Canadian team had just come back from being off in the summer, and they were going to use the Summit Games to train for the NHL. The Russian team trained hard the whole year to sharpen their skills for the game. The first game took place in Montreal. The Russians skated faster and had good technique of how they manipulated the puck on the ice. The Russians won the game, and the score was 7-3, and the Canadian nation was in disbelief. Russians showed the world how communism fostered sporting excellence and was one of the best games in Canadian hockey history. The second game took place in Toronto, and the Canadian team defeated the Russians and gave hope back to the audience. Game 3 took place in Winnipeg. A tie 4-4 in Winnipeg saw the Canadians blow a 2-goal lead. By the 4th game in Vancouver, the Canadian team realized that the underdogs were underestimated. The Russians won 5-3, and the Canadian team were booed off the ice. Game 5. This was the first game of the 8 games played in Moscow. The Canadian team lost the game by 1 goal. Game 6. Canada 3, USSR 2. In Game 6, the ice rink became warfare. These methods used from both teams against each other were radical. Both teams showed disrespect and poor sportsmanship, starting when Bobby Clarke was asked by his coach to break the ankle of a Soviet hockey player, Valery Kharlamov. Game 7. Canada 4, USSR 3. The warlike behavior continued. The Soviet player Boris Mikhailov sliced Canada's Gary Bergsman's shin pad so deep that his leg was bleeding. Game 8. Canada 6, USSR 5. The 8th and final game of the summit, Henderson's goal during the last 34 seconds of the game was one of the best moments in history. He scored the winning goal for the 6th, 7th, and 8th game of the summit. National leaders were present at the games, and they used the events for diplomatic reasons. Journalists followed the teams in each other's cities, capturing the culture differences for television audiences. The media had made these games' importances as equal as the world's biggest wars in history. The games played such a central role on attempting to prove which culture, ideology, and political institution was more successful. All started off as a friendly attempt to bridge the gap of the two countries and create positive relationships. Instead, the ice rink became a battlefield. It was a communist versus capitalism, and many players were influenced into playing the game to prove superiority instead of having fun. Finally, after the games ended, the Canadian team won. Canadian hockey experts embraced the strategies that the Soviets have used in the games and acknowledged how good they played. And this concludes my presentation. The information used in this presentation was taken from these references.